I'm Rana Isa, and I'm going to be interviewing the great Humphrey Davies. Humphrey Davies has translated 25 works of Arabic literature, both modern, including 5 novels by Elias Khoury. He's finishing now My Name is Adam. He translated Gate of the Sun, Yalo, Sin al-Kul, Broken Mirrors, and As If She Was Sleeping. And he is also very well known for his pre-modern or on the cusp of modernity work of translation, most famously الساق على الساق لأحمد فارس الشدياق, but also Shervini's هز القحوف, which he will be talking about tomorrow at 4 in Westfall Auditorium C. He read Arabic at the University of Cambridge, received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, and before publishing his first translation in 2003, worked for community development and research organizations in Palestine, Tunisia, Sudan, and Egypt. He lives now in Cairo and is affiliated with the American University in Cairo, but right now he comes from Abu Dhabi, where he's working on a third translation of what I'm calling offbeat literature from Arabic, which will come soon. We'll talk about it more tomorrow. So today we'll just focus on his translations of Elias Khoury's works. Let me start just by asking you, how did you become first acquainted with Khoury's novels, and why did you choose?
Sorry.
Okay. Why did you choose to translate it?
I first became acquainted with Bebe Shams, which was the first book that I translated of Elias Khoury's, when a friend of mine in Cairo, who'd been contacted by a publisher in Britain, was looking for a translator. I'd recently finished Amarja Ubien by Ala Aswani. She was aware of that, so put the two of us together. I have to confess, I was not aware of Elias's work to that point. But I read the book, and it struck me as unique, as almost something that I'd been looking for. It had that sense of, yes, at last, here's a text that I would really, really love to translate. And I think the fundamental reason for that is that it seemed to me that it dealt with issues that are exceptionally important, that it's fearless in the way in which it tackles the sorts of things that we in our ordinary lives think that we understand and set aside, like memory. We don't normally consider how memory works. And he constantly brings these things into the forefront, analyzes them, and makes one understand them better. In addition to that, I suppose there was, as to say, in addition to my being enthralled by the book as any ordinary reader and lover of literature would be, there was the added value, you could say, perhaps, of it being such a powerful work about the dispossession of the Palestinians. And though it would never, I think, be my goal, in fact, I definitely would reject the notion of translating a book about Palestinian dispossession if it were a bad book. It would be of no interest to me simply to do it as a political act. The fact that this is such a great book, and that it could therefore perhaps embed itself in the imagination of non-Arabic speaking readers, and therefore produce some change in attitudes, some change in understanding, was a huge plus, and made it even more important for me to translate the book.
Okay, so which of Elias's novels did you like working on the most, and which was the most challenging?
Well, I think that perhaps Yellow was the one that I liked working on the most, and the reason for that, I said Yellow, in case anybody didn't hear. The reason for that perhaps is a personal one. I mean, I don't see Elias's novels competing with one another as to which is the best. I mean, that's a pointless notion. But if in my personal development as a translator, when I translated Yellow, I felt that I got to be a much better translator than when I started translating Bab al-Shams. I felt much more comfortable. I felt that I was getting it much better. I was more familiar with some of the tricks and strategies of narration, and it was therefore a particularly sweet experience, perhaps, for me to translate it, and gave me a great deal of pleasure. As have translating all of Elias's books in the future, but that one sort of marked a point in my personal development as a translator that was important for me. As to the most challenging, well, I have to say, any novel of Elias's that uses, as so many do, deploys, as so many do, a great deal of poetry, and especially the poetry of al-Mutanabbi, has got to be considered a special challenge for a translator. Al-Mutanabbi, who figures, for example, enormously in CAH and is basically untranslated into English. A couple of attempts have been made. One, the great Arbery did a translation of some poems by al-Mutanabbi, but they were essentially cribs. I mean, he didn't intend them to be literary translations. He wanted them to be an aid for a student so they could at least understand how the language worked. But of course, you can't do that when you're translating a novel. It has to somehow, hopefully, at least give the impression that this is poetry, not just an extension of the prose into lines that are written in italics. And I reckon that actually the largest corpus of al-Mutanabbi translated into English at the present time is probably to be found in the translations of Elias Khoury's novels, which perhaps makes me the biggest translator of al-Mutanabbi, Razbin Anni, I have to say, in the world, or at least in the English-speaking world. One example of just how difficult, well, I mean, the point about Mutanabbi is that at times his brilliance and his élan almost leave meaning behind. He's playing, it's a display of verbal fireworks. And translators are always in search of meaning because they're always saying to themselves, I mean, this is the fundamental question of translation, I suppose, what does it mean? So if you have somebody who doesn't actually mean what he seems to mean, or perhaps even what Elias once said to me, yeah, I don't know exactly what he meant by that, you know, it's all... And to get that into English is perhaps difficult. One particular, I mean, perhaps the apex of all that is, I think it's in Ka'annaha, and I'm not sure now, and my memory is not clear whether this is al-Mutanabbi or another poet, but there's a wonderful several-page long passage in which Mansour is drinking arak, and he sits down and he starts to recite from the poet. Is it Mutanabbi? I can't remember. And he suddenly realizes, no, he's forgotten. It wasn't like that. No, it wasn't like that. It really goes, and he interrupts himself. And you as the translator are bumping along after this guy, trying to make sure that technically at least, I mean, he's going to change the Arabic. You're going to have to try and change the English so that it is very clear that this actually comes from, he could have been mistaken. In other words, the English must be somehow, or at least rhyme in the same way that the first verse that he mistakenly recited rhymes, and so on. I think that's probably was one of the most challenging passages that I've translated by Elias Khoury. As novel, qua novel, as novel, qua novel, they all have their challenges. I don't think I can pick out one specifically.
Can we define a Khoury novel the way we talk about the Mahfouzian novel? An author you also translated. What gets carried over from one text to another in the Khoury oeuvre?
I think I don't think you can pick up if somebody printed 3 sentences on a piece of blank paper from Elias Khoury and gave them to you. I think anybody who's read any other 3 sentences would say, oh, that's got to be Elias Khoury. There's no doubt about it. What exactly makes that the case is maybe harder to pin down. I think that there are probably some strictly stylistic strategies that Khoury uses that are carried over throughout his work. I was trying to recreate this in my mind, but without a text in my hand, I couldn't actually come up with many beyond perhaps the use of kana followed by an indefinite noun, as in kana daman. This is something that has occurred in many novels, and it feels to me very Khourian and not often met with, though I know it's grammatical and it happens in some texts, but the use of it by Khoury, I think, is perhaps more than elsewhere. Otherwise, obviously, it's the themes. I mean, which I feel are a bit like a lab technician here at a conference of astrophysicists. I mean, you know the themes, you know the issues far better than I do. But when you're reading Khoury, the first word probably that will occur within the first paragraph, maybe I exaggerate, will be hikaya. And that the universe is composed of hikayat is one of the things that most marks all, I think, of Khoury's novels. Memory, obviously, the endlessly recurring discussion, worrying at the notion of memory and what it is and what it isn't and how it serves us and how it betrays us. These are all things that carry over from one novel to the other. There are perhaps a couple of things that I haven't heard referred to, but which I find very characteristic. One is an interesting color. For example, in Beb Shams, there are a number of references to the word white. Is very large. I mean, probably, unusual to find one color so featured or given such prominence in a novel. In other novels, it sometimes, I think it's other colors. I mean, for example, in Sinalkol, there's a lot of green and also of yellow. But the important point is not, what color it is, but there is this visual aspect to the novels that intrigues me and makes them very characteristic or very distinct. Almost often this interest in color is associated with the also highly characteristic sort of leap into quantum space that happens sometimes where we're going along and the world is the world, and then suddenly we're in a different universe, a lyrically beautiful or terrifying. I hate to use the word magic realism because it's been so much used, and because quite probably I don't understand it the way that you do, because you all have read 1,000 books of magic realism and written, no doubt, another 1,000 books about it. But for example, there's a scene in Sinalkol in which the two boys, the twins, they were very young, and they become intrigued by the figure of somebody they call the Green Woman. She's a character who hangs around the neighborhood, and I can't remember the exact details, but they follow her to her house. And at one moment, to them, she ceases to be a green woman, and she becomes a tree. And that kind of, that so beautifully for me captures the ability, that captures the childish imagination. That she could be both a tree and a woman simultaneously, and that this is not something ridiculous or illogical. This is how it is. And the naughtier of the two boys picks up a stone and throws it at the woman or the tree, and the stone never falls. It just goes on through infinity, one may suppose. This kind of sudden lyrical epiphany is one of the things that I love most about Elias Khoury's novels, and that I think distinguishes them from any other writer that I know.
Elias positions himself in lineage with Ahmed Faris Shidia, Alf Layli wa Layli, and other canonical prose in the Arabic tradition. As someone who has worked on Shidia and Khoury, do you find a connection between the two authors?
Yes, I mean, one obvious connection, I think, is that they're both concerned, self-consciously concerned, explicitly concerned with language and how language works. So Shidiaq has, within his wonderfully very strong construction of this book, it amazes me. People say that it's a chaotic book, it's it's not. It's extremely well structured. And after I think it's every 15 chapters, there's a maqama. And the first maqama is called a maqama on chapter 13. Or is it a maqama on the concept of chapter 13? And it's this kind of ability to be in two spaces at once, that of the person who is writing because he wishes to tell a story, and that of the person who is watching the person who is writing and commenting on them, seems to me certainly present in Shidiaq and also, of course, in Elias's works, which, as we've already heard this morning, circle around this idea of writing, are constantly aware of the idea of writing, of the difficulty of writing, of the impossibility of writing, going from Baby Shams to My Name is Adam, I think. So, yeah.
If we are to follow the logic of translation studies theory, works of literature since the colonial era have been domesticated in what is called world literature. And you talked earlier now on how Bab al-Shams for you was a work that could introduce to an Anglophone audience the dispossession of the Palestinians in highly literary language. Theorists advocate, because of the imbalance between Arabic and English, they have advocated untranslatability as a way to preserve the integrity of a text. Does theoretical discourse on untranslatability and world literature appeal to you as a translator, and does it impact your work on Khoury? Is there a place where where you feel that in Khoury's work there is an untranslatable element that you need to preserve in the English?
Okay, this is where I feel especially like a lab technician. I have not devoted my life to reading the theory of translation. I have actually decided that the next 6 months of this year, or maybe 12 months coming, I will actually make this a project that I will try and get on top of all the theories of translation and see just for the intellectual interest. I personally don't believe that an awareness of literature of translation theory will make any difference to how I actually translate. I believe that the act of translation is not one that emanates from an intellectual framework that one is set up in one way. I have understood domestication and foreignization, and I will therefore translate as follows. I think the act of translation, in some sense, however humble, is perhaps an act of creation, and in moments of acts of creation, one doesn't think about theory. Having said that, as a kind of introduction, the least understandable thing to me of all the theoretical notions that I've heard about translation is that one shouldn't do it. I mean, this does strike me as bizarre. If I didn't translate, if everything is untranslatable, then what am I doing here? Maybe I don't understand exactly what is meant by untranslatable, but I can see, I have in my mind a concept of untranslatability in the context of untranslatability, but it is very limited, and it concerns technical issues such as the pun, right? If you want to reproduce a pun, you just have to pray to St. Jerome that you can, and occasionally, amazingly, you can, but that's because St. Jerome is a really good guy. But sometimes you can't, so you're just going to have to work around that and do something maybe similar somewhere else in the text close by, to somehow compensate, right? Poetry as a whole is another very difficult area in which one might say untranslatability lurks. But primarily from my perspective, because rhyme is another issue. It's very difficult to rhyme. It's in English. It's almost too easy, I would say, to rhyme in Arabic. Arabic produces, it generates rhyming forms and patterns. It is of the nature of the language. English doesn't do that. So, given that classically, at least, Arabic poetry is all mono-rhymed, you would be extremely lucky if you could come up with 10 rhyming words that would fit in the translation of a given poem. So that's a headache that one has to get around as best one can. Usually by trying to produce a translation that at least strikes me as a translator as somehow poetic. At least it isn't prose, but it's not going to be rhymed, and let us not even go to the notion that Arabic poetry has meters, right? Because English poetry has maybe 2, and we all know that Arabic has 16, right? So I think even that's a lost cause. But yeah, when it comes to does untranslatability mean, is it supposed to mean that there are certain words that you can't carry over? That, for example, if I'm describing a situation in a rosa and somebody pulls out a goza, that because nobody in England has ever been to a rosa, and that nobody in England, or at least fast-changing, may I say, fast-changing, nobody's ever seen a goza, at least they've seen shishas now, galore, that this is something that the translator has to work massively to overcome, or that it poses some really fundamental theoretical problem. I don't see that. A goza is an instrument for smoking ma'asil, or whatever it may be. And a rosa is a place where people smoke ma'asil and so on and use the goza. I think most audiences and most readers, and there's often a tendency to underestimate the readerly intelligence of readers, will quickly understand the functions of these things, even if you don't translate them. Suppose you just put the word goza into the text and just left it like that. The way that, for example, Amitav Ghosh, who's a writer I very much like, has written a trilogy of books about basically the Indian Ocean in the late 18th and early 19th century, featuring the opium trade and commerce and the interaction of peoples and so on. He must use 20 words per page that are completely unfamiliar to most readers, or one would assume. And I don't think, I've never heard it said that his books are unreadable. On the contrary, his books are, they have a large following, and people get it. They get what they need to get, and that's fine. And so, untranslatability, not high on my list of favorite things. Yeah. But please, tell me what it means in some way that would make better sense to me.
I'll ask. I just want to follow up on this, and then we open the floor. I have two questions. I mean, the problem of untranslatability, if we think, you gave us an example with Al-Mutanabbi and how it features in Elias's work as a particularly difficult intertextual reference to render, and also how the style of how it is written with interruptions and a work of memory that make it particularly challenging for a translator. So one can think of untranslatability this way, but one can also think of untranslatability in terms of, I mean, and here I'm going to the theories where they think of it in terms of politics, the politics of translation. Why do we translate Arabic literature in this case? Does it for the English reader, should the English reader be aware that what they are reading is a work of translation, and therefore they are not reading the entire text but reading a version of the text that the translator has produced for them? And does that impact the work that you do? Is there a particular way you translate to make sure that that your reader knows? Is it important actually for the reader to know that what they're reading is a work of translation and not originally English or what they call a domesticated text?
Yes, I think it is important, but on the other hand, I can't really imagine what a fully domesticated text would be. I mean, to me, when I'm reading a text, I'm reading a culture as well. I'm reading specificities, and those specificities can't be lost. And it's important that they not be lost. But who in their right minds would approach a book set in Lebanon in the middle of the 19th century and somehow try to work a magic, which would be extremely difficult, I would think, to pull off, to make the reader feel that they were reading about England in the 19th century or something of the sort. I mean, I think the works impose their own personalities. And so to make a huge hue and cry over domestication versus foreignization is probably a storm in a teacup, in my opinion. I know a lot of ink has been spilt on it into that same, many teacups full of ink. But from my purely translational perspective, it doesn't seem to me that it's as big an issue as people want to make out. You have talked about translation. I think there's an essential difference between things being difficult to translate and untranslatable. Untranslatable is an absolute, right? That's it. You can't do it. Difficult to translate is normal. I mean, many things are difficult to translate, pose specific difficulties, to which one can oppose certain strategies. And that's an essential, and there may be some confusion between these two things, but I think in the end there's a real difference. To claim that things cannot be translated. Well, if they cannot be translated, then the whole enterprise is a waste of time. And you mentioned world literature and the idea that somehow this is almost, I don't know in what, somehow this has become, within an academic discourse, an intrinsically bad thing. To me, world literature is simply the sum of books that have been written in the world. And for every book that you add, you change that concept. If you like, you complicate that concept. You see, I can speak that jargon too. And enrich it and offer readers yet more perspectives. And how can that be bad? I really want to know, how can that be bad?
One absolute last question. Have you read, because I know that Yalo and As If She Was Sleeping are translated twice, once by you and once by others.
By Marilyn Booth, yeah.
Marilyn Booth, As If She Was Sleeping, and I didn't know that Yalo was translated, but Frederique mentioned the translation she had used for her paper by Peter, I don't know, huh? Yeah.
Comment on that?
Do you read them?
No.
No.
In both cases, they were done either. In both cases, the other translations were done either simultaneously, or I think they were probably both cases done simultaneously at the same time that I was translating. The other person was translating, I think. So by the time mine was done, and theirs was done. Did I then rush to look at theirs to compare them? No, I haven't even held a copy of either translation. Well, that might be an exaggeration. Maybe at a bookstore I've pulled up Peter Thoreau's version of Yellow in order to put it at the back of the stack or something. No, I haven't. Why haven't I? Because suppose they translated it better. What am I going to do about it? Say, sorry, pulp all my versions. I'm going to do a new version. That wouldn't obviously work. Secondly, once I've done a book, frankly, I've done it. I rarely return to it. Partly because, well, I don't know, I'm on to the next book, in strictly practical terms, in terms of the time available and so on. But also, once you're done, you're done. And people then can take it, they can tear it up, they can love it, they can hate it, but it's a done deal. And I don't want then, to get, I don't have the stamina somehow to go and look at another translation and say, oh, they did it this way, they did it that way.
Thank you. We're open for questions. Michael? Just 1 second. You'll get the mic.
Thank you. I'm wondering how you approach the provision of notes and references to provide some of the local context that you can't spell out in the course of a text, and how do you negotiate that with, in this case, Elias Khoury? How much detail do you want to give without making it a very heavy academic book? You want to not interrupt the flow of the reading of the reader of a novel in particular. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd say that there are two, I've translated books in two modes. There's the modern novel, including Elias's novels, and today's publishers, in the Western world at least, are allergic to footnotes. They will not tolerate footnotes. They think that they interrupt the reader's concentration and more generally perhaps give the book an aura of academic, of something academic and, as you say, heavy. that would put readers off. So in those cases, most novels, and I think certainly in all of Elias's novels, I've made a glossary at the back, so that if you're really interested, if you want to know, if you're puzzled, hopefully, if I have included it, then you'll find it there. And I think that's very useful, especially in something like Sinalco, where there are so many references to the Civil War and to specific political formations and parties with which you can't really expect an English-speaking reader to be familiar, but which are significant. I mean, it's important to know that this was a left-wing group, this was a right-wing group, this was a Christian group, this was a Sunni Muslim group, whatever. And in all those cases, Elias has seen the text and he's seen the glossary as part of the text, and he has sometimes corrected, or I've asked specific questions, or he's pointed out errors, and it's been corrected on that basis. So that's the modern novel. The older novels, the older works that I've done were all done for the Library of Arabic Literature, which is a new-ish series, maybe 6-7 years old now, which aims to produce older works of Arabic literature in bilingual editions. The editors of that series talk of themselves as the series as being aimed at the general reader, a very difficult concept to perhaps really define when you're talking about who is the general reader for the biography of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. I guess it's not a stupid concept, because anybody might want who is not a specialist in that field might well want to know how a writer of that period went about writing a biography of a figure of that sort. And so they are not against notes, but they are against footnotes. Again, you cannot have footnotes because the notes have to be at the back. I personally don't quite get that. I mean, it seems to me that it's easier to look at a footnote at the bottom of the page than it is to go, and sometimes they're arranged by chapter, not in the LAL ones, but in many academic works. That's the academic, it's not just a translational thing, that's the academic standard, I think, these days. And it's even worse when you have to work out, okay, I'm now in chapter 16 and I'm applying the notes for chapter 16 at the back, and then, okay, I've arrived at what I want. So I'm a bit of a skeptic on the idea that notes are a bad thing, perhaps even in modern novels. I'm not sure. I know that, or I've been told that in the tradition of translations into Arabic from other languages, the footnote is often considered essential. I mean, is it Sami Anan who translated most of the great Russian classics, and he just sorry, Sami Drubi, yeah, and he Dostoevsky, and with plentiful footnotes, I believe. Yeah, I mean, so I think it's a question of what the audience expects and wants and will accept, and publishers try to adjust what they do with their practice to that, which is natural enough. But that there is a rule in the universe that footnotes are a bad thing, even in literature, is not proven to me.
It's kind of a provocative question, but given how central 1001 Nights is to Elias's work, and it kind of turns up in one way or the other in almost all of his pieces, are you going to ever attempt to do 1001 Nights? Because we need it.
Do we?
Yeah, there isn't a good
there are lots of translations.
But there isn't a good, proper, definitive. I mean, there's different people have taken different, manuscripts, and different have left out different tales, and we really need, I think, a proper, comprehensive version like the one you did with Shadia. But it's just a thought.
Yeah, of course, you're not just talking about a translation, you're talking about an edition and a translation, right? I mean, a massive undertaking. First question is not, would I ever live to see it through? The first question is, who would pay me to do it, right? That's the usual biggest constraint. I mean, the fact that LAL is publishing these books, which have never been translated before, in most cases, is due to the fact that it's massively subsidized. Any work of that, any undertaking of that sort would also have to be massively subsidized. Whether I would like to do it, I'd die to do it. Yeah, it would be amazing.
I have a follow-up question, though, if possible. When you did with your work on Shidyak, you, as part of also translating it, you also did a lot of work on the original text, as is evident in the, you edited, you kind of did some. And how is that for you as a translator? I'm just wondering.
Well, as far as Shidyak concerned, it was actually very easy because the offset edition had been published in Beirut. One could have hoped to come up with a copy of the original first edition, but it would have been very, very hard. I have eventually, just in the last month, actually held in my hands for the first time the original edition, but the offset was available. And I was very interested in the way that, in his orthography. And I thought that his orthography had to be preserved because it is not the standard orthography that we're told is the correct way to write Arabic. In many cases, it's quite different. And so I didn't want to lose that aspect of the text. So the only difficulty with editing was to make sure that the typists, who of course were used to standard spelling and orthographic convention, didn't change it because the whole thing had to be typed out. That was the biggest challenge. So it wasn't really, as an edition, it wasn't such a big deal. With some other works, the edition can be more time-consuming, for example, than the translation, and it poses a whole different set of problems. But it does do one good, very positive thing, which is it grinds your nose in the text. You've been through literally every pen stroke, more or less, when you're responsible for making an edition of a book. You know how even the closest of readers passes over a lot of things because they assimilate them quickly and don't really think about them. When you're doing an edition, you have to think about every single syllable and grapheme and so on and so forth. So it's a very good preparation for translating.
We'll take one last question, but I want to say that we're going to speak a lot more on Shidyak tomorrow at 4. At West Hall Auditorium C. Any more questions? Zena?
When we read Elias Khoury's novels, especially the Lebanese Civil War novel, we get a sense of the vernacular. When we read the Palestinian novel, we also get a sense of the vernacular, but also of these regional accents, issues of probably also folklore. How does that get through the translation? So we're talking in terms of untranslatability, but my question is very specific. So as a translator of different novels of Elias Khoury, how do you keep sense or keep track also of these vernacular differences across novels?
He has more than one dialect.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Sometimes I've been translating Elias's novels and find that I sort of suddenly realize, oh, I've been translating colloquial for the last 2 pages. But this goes back to the point that somebody made earlier in our earlier panel about the seamless integration of colloquial and non-colloquial in his works. And there are two issues, I think, with colloquial. One is, do I know what that word means? And sometimes I don't. And it is one of the biggest problems for a translator of Arabic that there are no, with one exception, there are, to my knowledge, no really serious, comprehensive dictionaries of Arabic dialects. And this obviously is a problem for a translator. But fortunately, I have the author himself to consult and to say, what does that mean? And khtiye, was that the word that was specifically Upper Galilean that was used by Manel in khtiye? See. So I have my consultant. He can tell me what it's about, and I can come up with an English equivalent. And when, in my opinion, the only way to go about translating colloquial as distinct from any other register of Arabic is to recognize, insofar as it is appropriate, that this is a more oral form, and therefore to use more oral forms in English. Without overdoing it, you know, one of the warning lessons in English literature about overdoing it on dialect is Rudyard Kipling. I don't know if anybody's read the dialect stories of Rudyard Kipling, in which uneducated English sergeants and non-coms knock around in India and address one another in a form of English, which may be actually now becoming interesting for the diachronic historian, the scholar of diachronic English, because he's presumably trying to represent real forms and so on, but are painful to read, absolutely painful. So, you know, you can't go overboard with oralism in a written medium, I think. Or if you do, it has to be very carefully handled. As to regionalism, I'm sorry. Okay, all right, untranslatable. Yeah. I can, all right, you got me there. You got me there. I mean, for example, in Amarat Yaqubiyan, there's a guy from Said, Upper Egypt, and he insists on saying "soh" instead of "sah." It's "soh." So I translated just that one word, "roigt," R-O-I-G-H-T, instead of "right," obviously. I mean, he was saying "soh." That's right. And just maybe that was the only word of his that I put into any form that wasn't at least a standard English orthography. But I hope that it will give the reader a sense that this guy comes from some kind of dialect area, right? That's not the same as the rest of the characters. I don't see how you can do much more than that. And why I decided to associate Upper Egypt with Dorset is another question. Not too obvious, perhaps.
Thank you, Humphrey Davies.